Story 1. I was in school when it happened. Some classes turned on their televisions and saw everything happen live. My class was not one of them. This is neither the time nor the place for watching television. The time, morning of September 11th. The place, history class. Story 2. I was 10, wondering why everyone was so sad on my birthday. Story 3. I was in a hotel getting ready to leave. I had the television on but was not really watching it. When I saw the video of the plane hitting the tower, I thought it was a preview for a Bruce Willis movie. Story 4. I was at home getting ready to head out. As I headed to the firehouse, I was the emergency medical services captain at the time. I heard lots of talk on the radio, but I was not sure what was going on. I got to the firehouse and turned on the television. One tower was ablaze, and I stood there in awe. Then the other plane hit. I wanted to help. I immediately started packing an ambulance with any gear and equipment I could find. I called the chief and told him I wanted to take 2 men and an ambulance to help. We were instructed to stand down and wait. It is a 3-hour drive on a normal day. It was very frustrating to watch events unfold and not be able to help. It was truly one of the most gut-wrenching days of my life. It is very vivid in my mind. I am 52 now, and it still hurts. My heart is in agony for all the families who were forever changed that day. Not to mention all the people who perished that day and in the years after as a result of the poisonous dust cloud from debris. Unfortunately, this event will be lost to time, as all things are. Some will remember, some will forget. The only hope we can have is that it does not happen again. We are here for such a short time. It has always bothered me that there is so much hatred in this world of ours. Peace and love to everyone. Story 5. I was in my dorm room and saw it on television. Then I realized I could look out my window and see it with my own eyes. I ran to the top of a campus building and saw smoke billowing out of the towers. We were frightened by fighter jets scrambling over our heads and got off the roof. It was a terrifying time. Story 6. I was 24, working in an office building in Charlotte, North Carolina, browsing a Dave Matthews Band message board at my desk. Someone posted about it on the non-Dave Matthews Band side, and I checked the Drudge Report, which had only 2 articles on the first page and a frame grab of the burning tower from CNN. Everyone stopped working and went to the break room to watch it on the news. Around 11 a.m., they sent everyone home. Then my girlfriend at the time spent the next 2 days glued to the television. Story 7. Remember this day like it was yesterday. Senior year of high school in Brooklyn, New York. I was in a business entrepreneur class led by a teacher, Mr. P. We had access to computers in this class, and my classmate had the news channel on. He started reading breaking news and then informed the teacher about the first plane. He then said, "If we go outside, we can see the towers." That's exactly what we did. The entire class went outside, and we saw a plume of smoke in the distance. The high school was near Manhattan Beach, so the Manhattan skyline was visible. We saw the second plane hit in the distance as well. We rushed back inside the high school, where we were dismissed shortly after. Public transportation was suspended, so I remember the hour-long walk home. I came home and watched the rest on television. My dad worked in Manhattan at the time, but he was uptown, so he wasn't affected, thankfully. It was a wild day overall. Story 8. Standing in the shadow of the South Tower, just outside the farmer's market, a mist of pulverized glass rained down on my head. Story 9. I was at middle school in the library studying for a test when a student came rushing in and yelling, "Some idiot flying a plane just hit the World Trade Center in New York City." We did not know until later that it was American Airlines. Story 10. Sitting in my 9th grade American history class, ironically enough. Story 11. I was in school. When the World Trade Center towers were hit, school ended, and teachers walked around like zombies. Story 12. I was the building supervisor for ABM Industries at 2 World Trade Center on the 4 a.m. to 12 p.m. shift. My wife worked on the 89th floor of World Trade Center 2 for Keefe, Bruyette and Woods, an institutional investment banking firm. She woke me up and told me that 1 World Trade Center was on fire, and you could almost feel the heat on the window of her office. I knew the evacuation procedures because we practiced them. I told her to leave the building immediately because they were going to instruct people to stay at their desks since the windshield alone could push debris all the way out onto Church Street. So the fewer people on the streets, the better. Thankfully, even though my wife loved her job, she hated working, so she walked out. I told her to take the stairs. But thank God she didn't listen to me. She took the elevator to the 44th floor setback and then took the stairs. The second plane hit while she was on the 23rd floor stairwell. She fell down the stairs with about 8 to 10 other people, landing on top of her and fractured her back in 2 places. Those were the worst 45 minutes of my life when I couldn't get in touch with her. When the second plane hit, I thought I had killed her by telling her to take the stairs from the 89th floor. Her experiences are recorded in the audio diary of what some people experienced on September 11th. Story 13. I was sitting in the waiting room at my obstetrician's office, 8 months pregnant with my daughter. I was reading a magazine while the television was on. When I heard the receptionist scream in horror, I jerked my head up to look at the television. I remember a sinking feeling in my gut, knowing that my daughter would be born into a time of turmoil and fear. Story 14. Second period chemistry class in high school. The principal gave a long, rambling update about what had happened over the intercom. Then we continued with the rest of our day with a very dark vibe. We did not have access to a television, so no one knew exactly what happened until they got home that evening. Story 15. I was working at Hill Air Force Base in a back shop doing sheet metal repairs for a Lockheed C-130 Hercules. One of my coworkers was a retired military veteran. He told me this attack just opened a can of worms in the Middle East. How right he was. Story 16. I was a baby. My mom, on the other hand, was in Washington State with her disaster search dog, instructing with a few others when the planes hit. Nearly everyone started to scramble to figure out how to get back because there were many dogs and people from several task forces. I don't know exactly how, but my mom was able to get a ride with her partner dog Otto, and they went back east, heading to the Pentagon. They were deployed for weeks, combing through the disaster site attempting to find pieces of the deceased to bring them home. Otto is well known and was one of the dogs featured. It is still unbelievable to see her and him at what was left of the Pentagon. Story 17. I was getting ready for kindergarten. I was watching Public Broadcasting Service Kids when all of the channels changed to footage of the first tower. I remember hearing my grandmother gasp when the second one was hit. We watched it all unfold on the news. Every channel had something about it. I remember my grandmother and my mother debating whether or not they should send me to school. I am Canadian, and the chances of something happening were basically nothing, but my family still insisted I stay home. Story 18. Walking into my advanced placement United States history class, the television was on. Mrs. Norris said, "Sit down and watch. History is on television today." And we did. I still remember it like it happened yesterday. Story 19. I was asleep when the first World Trade Center tower was hit, but my father woke me up and then I was glued to the news for the rest of the day. I had class that afternoon, which I did attend, but only about a third of the students were there. The no-shows were not penalized, but those of us who were present received extra credit. Story 20. I was trying to get to Los Angeles International Airport to catch a plane that crashed in a field in Pennsylvania. I got to the airport and was told the plane would not be arriving and the airport was closing effective immediately. I spent the next week sleeping in the theater of the Westin Marquis. Story 21. Sitting in Mr. Lanning's first period study hall, the teachers rushed a large CRT television on an audiovisual cart into the room just in time to see the second plane hit live. I remember him turning and staring at us with pure fear. After I was shot in Afghanistan 9 years later, I was home in New York on convalescent leave. I got a knock at my front door, and it was Mr. Lanning. We just stared at each other in stunned silence for a minute. My war began and ended in front of him. Story 22. I was getting ready for a job interview. It was canceled. Story 23. I was at my grandfather's funeral. I did not know anything about the attacks until later in the day. Story 24. My organic chemistry class was canceled, so we went to the student center and played Big Buck Hunter. On our way out, We saw one of our professors who tried to explain what was happening but could not find the words. I left school, went to the bank, then home, and sat in shock in front of the television for the rest of the day. I remember trying to call my girlfriend, now wife, because she was in the city, but the phones were all down, most likely because everyone was doing the same thing. Story 25, Watching Batman, the animated series. I was 5 years old, and I remember getting upset because my dad had turned the television to the news and went to play outside. Story 26. I was at work at a trading firm with a big open floor plan, doing whatever, and one of the traders said, "Hey, a plane just hit the World Trade Center." We were mostly like, "Whoa, that's crazy, nice piloting, bro," and kept working. Then a bit later, he said, "Hey, another plane just hit the World Trade Center." And everybody went nuts. Total shock and fear spread through the whole office. We were right across from the Sears Tower in Chicago, and there were rumors that the tower might be a target, so everybody was evacuated. I remember the loop was total mayhem, trains were packed, and cell phone networks were so jammed that phones were useless. It was a super scary train ride home. I half expected an explosion to flood the tunnels and drown us all. Such relief to make it home to my apartment and watch the footage replayed over and over again in disbelief. Story 27. Deployed to Kuwait with the National Guard. Had just gotten off shift earlier that morning and was doing laundry when the first plane hit the towers. Not long after the plane hit the Pentagon, alarms started going off around the base. We grabbed our rifles and body armor. I do not think we got more than 2 hours of sleep in a row for the next 6 weeks. Story 28. Holding my 16-hour-old daughter while caring for my post-operative wife in the hospital. It is surreal how joyful and painful this time is for us. She no longer speaks to us, so it hurts much more now. Story 29. Teaching a middle school class at a private school in Virginia. My principal pulled me out to explain that the Department of Defense was also hit. Some of our students had relatives who worked there, but I believe none of them passed away. Story 30. New Jersey office with view of New York City skyline. The sad part was listening to the radio and updating people in the office. One person was from Cantor Fitzgerald and worked in the World Trade Center. I have never seen someone turn so pale instantly when I said the first tower fell. Story 31. I worked on a trading floor in San Francisco. We were all gathered around the walls of monitors, watching live as the second plane hit, killing our employees at our sister office in Manhattan. The head of trading instructed me to immediately evacuate our San Francisco employees, saying that he was not waiting for a plane to hit the Transamerica Tower. Horrifically surreal. Imprinted so hard in my memory that I remember what I was wearing that day. Story 32. I was a graduate student and must have woken up around the time the first tower was hit, because when I got out of bed and logged on, people were reacting online. I turned the television on just in time to see the second tower. I do not remember if classes were canceled or if we just did not bother to go, but I spent most of the rest of the day watching the news at a friend's house and the remainder of the day writing the introduction to a collection of Mark Twain's essays about the nature of mankind, my first professional writing job. Felt like a surreal topic to have on my plate. Story 33. In the cafeteria in 10th grade taking the Armed Services Vocational Aptitude Battery Test. When I finished, I went to a class just in time to see the second plane hit. Story 34. I haven't really posted much about September 11th over the years, but as I write this, I'm struck by what was my very own close call. I've seen numerous accounts of people who were supposed to have been at the World Trade Center that day but weren't there for various reasons, in many cases very possibly saving their lives. I was in my apartment north of New York City getting ready to leave and go on the train into the city, then the subway near the World Trade Center for a meeting with restaurant associates who I worked with. I had just finished up the United States Tennis Open in Flushing the night before. As I was walking out the door, I got a phone call to turn on the television. It was a perfect, crisp fall day with not a cloud in the sky. I could clearly see all the rising smoke and dust in lower Manhattan from the view I had standing on the roof of my building. I also lived just a few miles south of Indian Point Nuclear Power Plant, which was on the list of possible targets for September 11th. The first plane, American Airlines Flight 11, flew straight down the Hudson River. I lived right on the river overlooking the Tappan Zee Bridge. Just another hour more that morning and I would have been at the World Trade Center. Story 35. I recently graduated from college and was working in Washington, District of Columbia. We woke up to news of the first plane hitting the first tower. At that point, we thought it was just a careless pilot who made a mistake. So my roommate and I left for work as usual. Either by the time we got there or shortly after I arrived, the second plane hit, and we realized that something serious was happening. We all gathered around to watch the coverage on my colleague's black and white television that he happened to have in his office. When we saw the news about the Pentagon, we rushed upstairs because we could see it from the roof of our building. We saw the building smoking and collapsed, although we could not see the plane. Family and friends tried to get through to make sure I was okay because they knew I worked close to the Pentagon, but so many people called that no one could get through. Everything shut down and our office closed. Luckily, one of the partners offered to drive me home because the Washington Metro had already shut down by then, and I was several miles from my apartment. The rest of that night, my roommate and our friends sat on the roof of our building in complete shock about what was happening. The next day, I flew to my aunt's house for Rosh Hashanah. The flight was not canceled, but there were very few people at the airport. I had a Swiss Army knife that I always carried with me, which got through security without a problem, something I only realized after I landed. The world really changed from that day forward. It may sound dramatic to say, but it truly marked a turning point. The details blurred together, so as someone pointed out, I did not fly on the 12th. It was probably closer to the 14th or 15th, but there were still very few people in the airports. Story 36. I was 12 years old in military boot camp for juveniles at the San Luis Obispo military base. We were brought into a room with the TV on, and I will never forget the sergeant saying that we were witnessing history. The base went on lockdown with full military police at every entrance and exit. Parents were very anxious trying to contact us to make sure we were safe. We were safer than they were at that base, that's for sure. Story 37. Working in the warehouse at Best Buy before the store opened. We were listening to Howard Stern. We ran out to the sales floor and turned on the televisions just as the second plane hit. I left work early, picked up my children from school, and went home to watch the news for the rest of the day. Story 38. I was out making deliveries on my bicycle. It was warm, so I stopped at a store for a cold drink. They had the television on. I saw the first tower go down. I raced back home and turned on the television. The second tower was starting to fall. I felt so helpless, with nothing I could do but watch. Story 39. I was sitting in first grade watching the teachers turn on the television and all the children get picked up early from school. Story 40. Ninth grade, high school theater class. I was almost late and my school was petty. If you did not sit down before the bell rang, they kicked you out of class, and you just sat in the lunchroom doing nothing the entire class. Nobody noticed, though, because they were all gathered around an AM and FM radio with horrified expressions on their faces. The kicker was that I had just moved from New York City to Houston, Texas the month prior. Story 41. I was at school. After the first airplane hit, they had the news on the television. Then the second one hit and everyone started freaking out. I remember my teacher saying America just went to war. I was just about to turn 18 and was thinking I might get drafted. That was a crazy time. Story 42. I was a sophomore in high school in a video production class. We were busy filming, but when the class period ended, we left the room. People in the class next to us came out and were talking about it. Some idiot flew a plane into the World Trade Center. My next class was Algebra 2. The teacher had recently switched to teaching after working at the Pentagon. We didn't have a television in the class, but she was emailing one of her coworkers who was watching cable news network. She told us the latest message was that they were evacuating the building because it had just been hit. The next class was chemistry. Our teacher brought us into another science class that had a television, and we watched the news as the second tower fell. Around that time, the principal sent an email to all teachers forbidding them from letting us watch the news. It was very frustrating not to know what was going on until my fifth period, when our world history teacher, who was close to retirement age, let us watch because, first, it was world history, and second, what are they going to do to me? Story 43. showering in a hotel room in Rosslyn, Virginia. Then, when I was toweling off and turned to look at my wife, they said one hit the Pentagon. I opened the curtains to see the smoke plume. Pretty much the only thing between us and the Pentagon was Arlington Cemetery. Story 44. In the Chambers Street subway station when the first airplane hit, about a quarter mile from the World Trade Center. Story 45. Physical education class at a local park. My mother rushed us home and made me fill up the bathtubs with water, as she feared more attacks and a potential power loss. Story 46. Working at a Starbucks in Fort Lauderdale, a customer came in and told us that someone had dropped a dirty bomb on New York and that thousands of people were already dead. Our supervisor would not let us turn on the radio to check the news, nor would they let anyone leave early, threatening immediate termination. I had to work my entire shift while trying to discreetly gather information from customers before I could leave at the end of my shift. People came in all day saying all kinds of crazy things, and no one at work had any idea what was going on. It was terrifying, and I kept trying to figure out at what point it would be appropriate to tell my boss to leave and go home to be with my family. It was almost a relief to learn it was just the planes and not a nuclear bomb. Story 47. Rest area in Northern Virginia. Got out to urinate and another driver said a plane just hit a tower. On the way back to the truck, another driver said a second plane had hit. I hopped in the bunk and watched the news all day. Story 48. Third grade West Coast child in 2001. Mom woke me up and told me New York was being attacked. We lived off the grid, and the television and generators were reserved for nighttime, occasionally holidays. Mom turned on the generator to watch the news that morning. Honestly, it was hard to understand what was happening. All I knew was that I did not like it. Story 49. I was in third grade. I remember eating my pudding and looking out the window, seeing people running up the street. I lived in New York, but not in Manhattan, so the people were probably running to a subway to get there or something. My dad worked for Xerox Corporation and was in a meeting. He did not see the towers go down, but saw the smoke in the streets. My mom worked for a church near the towers. She was 8 months pregnant and helping hand out water and food. My aunt, a 6th grade English teacher, saw the towers go down from her classroom and screamed in the middle of class. She hurriedly tried to pull down the shades to block the windows, but her students had already seen the strikes. Story 50. I was worried about my partner who was caught in the dust cloud. Story 51. I remember listening to radio coverage in the car on the way home from school and hearing the second tower collapse. My toddler sister was confused about why she could not watch cartoons on the television. Story 52. I broke up with my ex on September 7, 2001, so I finally woke up feeling happy and hopeful on September 11th. Story 53. My mom picked me up from school that day. We live in Europe. On the way, the radio mentioned a plane accident in New York. When we got home, I turned on the TV, and all channels were showing the first tower burning. About a minute later, I saw the second plane hit the second tower live on TV. I immediately knew that was not an accident. Story 54. I was asleep. I live in Western Canada, and I was in high school at the time. A friend of mine called and woke me up to tell me. I remember it as clear as day. It reverberated across the continent. This was not the type of friend who would normally call with this kind of information. Story 55. Getting ready for the academic year. I saw it when I went over for carpool on the neighbor's television. They continued to believe it was a private jet. The other one came next. We were out later in the day selling yearbook advertising space when we saw it on the news in different places. We sold a few advertisements, but that was not our primary goal for the day. Going through the motions while your mind is focused on something very different and life-altering is a little strange. Story 56. Senior year of high school. School went into communications lockdown. Internet shut off. TVs turned off. All while sitting in my 12th grade integrated physics and geometry class. Our government was about to bomb someone. Story 57. I was in English class writing poems. I remember I told someone that his poem was bad. We became friends afterward. Story 58. I was 4 months old. I was probably crying for more breast milk. Story 59. Getting ready to go to the Milwaukee Brewers versus St. Louis Cardinals game. That never happened that day. Story 60. I was in second grade, transitioning back from a special class. I asked to go to the bathroom in the hallway, and my teacher told me to go quickly and come right back. Two older girls in the bathroom were talking about a plane crash. When I returned to my class, my teacher was explaining that we were being dismissed early because of an emergency. I did not connect the two events until I watched the news when I got home. Story 61. I was in 8th grade and had just arrived to my second period class. The bell rang, but the teacher was not in the room. This was not completely unusual. Sometimes they go to the bathroom or step out briefly and return shortly. However, a full 15 minutes passed without the teacher showing up, which was strange. Our classes were only 50 minutes long, so 15 minutes was a significant amount of time. We were being loud and rowdy, not seated, and typically, some teacher would at least stop by to tell us to quiet down and sit down. Finally, the teacher burst into the room and sprinted to the front of the class. He had not said anything yet, but the way he entered and the expression on his face made us all quiet. We could tell something serious was happening. He was carrying a portable radio and announced in a very agitated tone, "The World Trade Center has been bombed." I do not remember him saying anything else. I am not sure if all of us Midwest kids understood exactly what the World Trade Center was, but we knew the situation was serious. We spent that entire period listening to the news broadcast on that radio. I am fairly certain that for the rest of the day, we did not do any classwork. We still changed classes at the bell, but each classroom had one of those large CRT televisions on rolling racks, and we just watched the news. I also recall that for at least a week, maybe two, we returned to our regular classwork, but the televisions remained in the classrooms, tuned to the news. There is something about my timeline that feels a little off. I do not remember what my first period class was, but I distinctly remember this was my second class of the day, social studies, which would have been at 9 a.m. Central Time, an hour and 15 minutes after the first plane hit the World Trade Center at 8:46 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. I guess in 2001, not everyone was constantly glued to the news, so not everyone had heard about it yet. If someone did hear about it, they may not have fully grasped how serious it was, and if they had, they did not yet interrupt first-hour classes. Story 62. I was in Orleans, France, wandering around, blissfully unaware that anything had happened for almost a full week. Story 63. At my desk in the United Kingdom while hosting some United States executives who had bought the company I worked at. I quickly set up a satellite news feed for them before the second plane hit. Story 64. I'm Canadian and was 17 in 2001. I faked being sick from high school that day because I was in a long-distance relationship with an American girl at the time, and we had stayed up the entire night talking on the phone. I was too tired to go to school and was sleeping in. My mom called me from work and said, "There's something going on in New York, something about planes. Can you turn on the television and call me back?" This was before smartphones and news apps, so she had no clue what was happening. I turned on cable news network, and they were reporting that a plane had hit the World Trade Center. I saw the smoke and all that. I called her back to tell her the news. I was watching the feed when the second plane hit and when they hit the Pentagon. It was beyond belief. I called my long-distance relationship partner and woke her up to make sure she was okay since she lived really close to Arlington, Virginia. We were both in total shock. The next few days were totally surreal. In fact, life has felt pretty surreal in general since then. That was the end of the everything is going great feeling that had existed during the 1990s and the start of whatever this is now. Story 65. My ex-husband was working in the city at the time, and my daughter called me during her freshman year in college to say she couldn't reach her father. I reassured her that I was sure he was fine. All I could do was imagine him buried under tons of concrete. I know emotions were still raw from when he walked out on us. He crossed the Brooklyn Bridge and was fine. Story 66. I was walking home from school in the United Kingdom. I walked through my front door as the second plane hit because I saw my parents watching it live. Story 67. I was at school, but we were sent home early. This was not in New York, but in another major city because they feared it might be targeted. Story 68. Sleeping, since we are 3 hours behind due to the time difference. My mother burst in to wake me up and asked if I had seen what had happened. Then I was sent to school with the family cell phone just in case. Story 69. I was in 3rd grade, and I couldn't figure out what this had to do with not being allowed outside at recess. Story 70. I was 8 years old and I was in Japan. When it happened, I was asleep, but I remember waking up and seeing the news. I still remember it as an 8-year-old in Japan. It was so surreal watching the planes hit. Story 71. With my then-girlfriend on a Jeep safari up Mount Tide in Tenerife. We had a break mid-afternoon where many people went to the beach, but we headed for a bar, and the event was on all the televisions. I remember meeting back up for the next part of the trip, and no one would believe what we had been describing to them. Story 72. Probably sleeping, considering under 2-week-old babies usually just sleep. Story 73. I was at work when the department receptionist came back and said that a plane hit the Twin Towers. I assumed it was a private plane. The thought of terrorist activity did not occur to me. Story 74. Waiting at a bus stop on my way to work. Listening to National Public Radio on the radio. I heard the news and thought of calling my wife but decided against it. By the time I got to work, I very much needed to call my wife. Story 75. I was sleeping because I worked the 3rd shift at the airport. I still lived at home since I had just graduated high school that summer. My dad woke me up early, which he never did, and said, "Get up. This is big, you have to see this." I was still tired, and it seemed like a dream for the first few minutes. I did not go to work for a few days because the airport was closed. Story 76. Rolled out of bed and saw people jumping out of a building when I went downstairs to join my parents watching television before school. It was a rough start to my senior year. Seeing the second plane hit live was bewildering. Story 77. It was my first day in boot camp. I did not find out what happened until a few days later. Story 78. At work, watching in the lunch area on the televisions, wondering if I was going to be called back to the military for World War III. Story 79. Eating breakfast on a warship, a cruiser. Things escalated from a casual naval routine to an intense emergency very quickly. Story 80. The loudspeaker in class came on with the news saying that a plane had crashed into the World Trade Center. The television came on and we all watched. Harrowing. Story 81. I was watching an Italian children's show called Melavision, which was interrupted by breaking news about the event. I called my parents, who came to watch the news with me. Story 82. I was working at BMW United Kingdom and we watched everything on the British Broadcasting Corporation news website, which became so congested that it went to text only. Story 83. I was a freshman in high school. I was at study hall, and I remember them wheeling in a television. I watched my art teacher standing there, with her hand covering her mouth in total shock. Story 84. Teaching. I did not even know anything had happened until lunchtime. Story 85. Sleeping in my apartment. I did not wake up until 11 a.m. I watched a bit of the news, but I was an immature 20-year-old and did not really care. I drove up to visit my future wife at college. I could not believe the lines for gas that evening. Story 86. I was in the 2nd grade, so I had no idea what was going on. When the planes hit, I don't think any of us knew because social media was not really a thing. If the teacher did know, she was not going to tell us and cause a panic. To me, it was just a normal day. Around 8:45 to 9 a.m., I was probably reading at my desk or doing a worksheet. I remember my principal had to walk us home after school, and my parents were acting differently. I thought that was odd, but I was still too young to really understand what happened until about a year later when we were taught about it and I was better able to grasp what actually happened. Story 87. I worked as a chef mostly nights. My morning routine was to wake up early, go to my living room, and fall back asleep with the television on. The television was on when the news interrupted with reports about the first tower being hit. I watched live as the second tower was hit. The station was also speaking with a reporter at the Pentagon, who said he felt what seemed like a bomb going off. I spent the rest of the day watching television in shock about the events unfolding. Story 88. I had a nearly 1-year-old child at the time. I was in San Francisco, although originally from New York. I was in the living room with him playing and had the television on. The television stayed on for the next 4 days. Story 89. I was on a beach on a small island off Croatia in the Adriatic Sea that had no internet. I had no idea that anything had happened until I turned on my phone hours after the event, and about 40 messages appeared. I did not realize what a big deal it was until the next day, and I did not fully understand what had happened until we got back to the mainland several days later because I do not speak Serbo-Croatian. I basically missed the biggest, most consequential news event of my lifetime. Story 90. I was in school. I remember a kid from another class going around telling people that a skyscraper fell down in Manhattan. We were in Queens. Then we got an announcement from the principal that our parents were coming to pick us up and there would be no school tomorrow. A friend and I had just come up with a secret handshake, so we did it because, of course, we had no idea something bad had happened. The teacher yelled at us, and we were confused. I also remember when my mom picked me up, and as we walked home, she kept looking up at the sky. It wasn't until we got home that I saw what had happened. Story 91. I had just gotten married. If we had honeymooned, we would have flown out of New York to get home that day. But I was starting a new job, so we did not honeymoon. On that day, I was walking in London and saw some Arab cab drivers gathered around a small TV looking shocked. I went to see what they were watching and saw the second plane hit the second tower. As reality sank in and different countries started reacting, we received reports that London was also going to be attacked. I called my new wife, who was a teacher, explained what was happening, and told her to keep an eye on the news and respond as needed while I would do the same. I ended up going home and watching it all unfold that day. To be honest, it felt like that was our generation's day when innocence was lost. I still see people jumping from that footage long ago. So inhumane and so terrible. Story 92. Taking my battle tank driver's license and heading to my hometown to take the regular driver's license the next day. Story 93. Hangover wake-up at the University of California, Santa Barbara. I was 21. We planned to get up early and ride roller coasters all day at Magic Mountain. I woke up to my roommate yelling, "It's World War III." We did go to Magic Mountain the first day they reopened. It was a ghost town, the best day ever because we couldn't let the terrorists win. Story 94. Watching it as a 10-year-old. Ironically, years later people blamed me for causing it based on the color of my skin. Story 95. I was sleeping in very late here in the United Kingdom. My grandfather woke me up to tell me what was going on. Story 96. 8th grade band class. A teacher came in and quietly told our teacher what had happened. Then our teacher wheeled in a television and turned on the news. We saw the second plane hit in real time a couple of minutes later. Story 97. Sleeping in my dormitory, my friend and roommate burst in through the door, panicked and swearing. He turned on the television and we watched the chaos. Story 98. I was early to a percussion sectional at my middle school and watched it all unfold on the television my band director had rolled in. Story 99. Packing my apartment in the Hartford, Connecticut area. I was moving soon. The television was on. It was a perfect fall day. Scared me very much, and I was more than 2 hours away in the suburbs. Story 100. I was in art class. The teacher did not know she was not supposed to turn on the television. So we saw the second episode while we drew our evolution art, like an egg turning into a bandage. Story 101. I worked the night shift and had moved out from my parents' house only a week or so before. I did not have a television or internet set up yet. I did not find out about it until I got to work that evening. Story 102. In detention. A friend told me what was happening, and I thought he was lying. I got home and turned on the news. Story 103. In grade 9 science class, the teacher brought out the television, and we all watched the live coverage. We did not finish our physics section that day. Story 104. Just walked out of a restaurant in Valencia, Spain. The flights in and out were completely different. Security was very strict that week. Story 105. Driving my children to school. I turned on the radio in the car and heard the news about what was happening. I dropped the children off and drove to work while listening to the radio reports. When I arrived at work, the television was on in the conference room, and all the office staff were there watching. Story 106. I was on a college internship. I heard the news in the elevator on the way to the office. We listened to the radio and refreshed news sites all day. Story 107. One of my first days of high school, I thought it was a weird prank or drill they do to trick the freshmen. Story 108. In my second week of kindergarten, it was the first live event I remember seeing on television. Story 109. I had just come home from school and heard on the way back that something had happened. I turned on the television to see the second plane hit the second tower. Needless to say, 11-year-old me was shocked and glued to the television for the rest of the day. Story 110. I was 24 in the Netherlands, so it was early afternoon. I was at my side job with a television guide, so several televisions were on in the building. Some people shouted that a plane crashed into the World Trade Center in New York. Everybody came to the television and saw the second plane hit. No more work was done that day. Story 111. Getting ready for school. I saw it on the neighbor's television when I went over for carpool. They thought it was a private plane. Later, the other one hit. Later in the day, we were out selling yearbook ad space and ended up watching it on the news at various businesses. I managed to sell a few ads, but it was far from our main focus that day. It was surreal going through the motions while my mind was occupied by something completely different and world-changing. Story 112. Walking back from a physics recitation freshman year in college was a beautiful day. Really similar to today, actually. Story 113. Sitting in a library basement at Northeastern University in Boston, receiving training to be a teaching assistant for undergraduate students. There was no internet access and only limited information available. When we broke for lunch, I tried to go online, and the only websites responding with information were the cable news network homepage and Slashdot. Story 114. I was in Calculus 1 my freshman year of college. I did not know anything about it until I walked to my sorority house after class and was surprised to see everyone gathered around the television in a common area at that time of the morning. Classes were canceled for the rest of the day. Story 115. I was watching music television. It still played music then, and I remember thinking something big must be happening because a message came up on the screen telling me to change the channel to a news channel. Story 116. I was in 9th grade in a medical terminology class. The television came on automatically, and my teacher turned it off. We continued with class as usual. A few years later, I dated a girl who was attending school in New York at the time. She and her roommate were driving the roommate's boyfriend to the airport and stopped to take a photo. One of the planes that hit the tower can be seen in the background of the photo. Story 117. I had awakened and sat at my computer, logged into a message forum I frequented back then. A person had moments earlier posted, "Did I just see a plane go into a building on live television?" I turned on my television, and the rest followed. Story 118. I pretended to be sick to skip school that day. I just did not feel like going. I watched everything from my living room. Story 119. I was in 4th grade, and we were forced to watch it repeatedly. Over time, many Muslims and Indians were being bullied. Some people did not consider Indians as Asians but rather as Middle Eastern, sadly at the time. Story 120. I was getting ready for school when my father called me to watch the news. A plane had just hit the World Trade Center. As we watched, we saw the second plane hit. That was when we knew for sure it was intentional. For some reason, I still went to school. Sitting in French class watching people jump. I remember when the tower collapsed, creating a big cloud of smoke. It was unbelievable. Story 121. In the back seat for a 9-hour trip to the beach with my parents. We stopped at Wendy's and went inside to get takeout food, and it felt really strange. My mom and I took the food to the car while my dad used the restroom quickly. A man at the urinal told my dad something. He didn't believe him until he checked the radio. Story 122. I was in Las Vegas with my pregnant wife, wondering if it was really a good idea to bring a child into the world. Las Vegas is not a place you want to be when things get serious. Story 123. In the United States, I am getting ready to take my mother to the airport to fly to Saudi Arabia. My friend called me at 6 a.m. to watch the news and to make sure my mother was okay that morning. My mother and I ran to turn on the television, watched and cried in horror. Story 124. I was in school when everything suddenly stopped. Teachers were glued to the television, and we all realized that something significant was happening, even if we did not fully understand it at the time. Story 125. I lived in California. I woke up around 8 a.m. Pacific time, drove into work listening to CDs, and had no idea anything had happened. I saw the parking lot was kind of empty and thought it was strange. When I went in, the few people there were watching TV, and I asked what was going on. The technicians just responded, "They're gone." I found out later that morning that one of my coworkers caught an earlier flight home from a work trip. He was on the flight that hit the Pentagon. They made his cubicle at work a memorial. After a few months, they rearranged the cubicle seating and made me take his old cubicle memorial. His stuff was still in the drawers. The whole situation was really difficult. I left that position not long afterward. Story 126. I woke up and heard sports radio talking about a plane that had hit one of the towers. I couldn't see it, and the announcer was saying it was awful but made some reference to the Death Star, which was very confusing. I got on the train and went to the gym where I got on a bike right in front of a big screen and watched it all unfold as I was exercising. At one point, I realized I wasn't riding anymore and was just sitting there slack-jawed. Almost the whole gym was standing behind me watching, and many people were openly crying. I am in San Francisco, so we were removed from it all. Then I realized my gym was at the bottom of a very large, notable building on the waterfront, so I left to go to the office. I got a call from my boss saying not to come in. The one thing I'll never forget was a homeless person standing in the road pointing at everyone, screaming, "You did this! You did this!" I never knew if he was even aware of what had happened. I certainly didn't stop to ask, but it made a horrible event even more surreal. Story 127. Floating around my mother's ovaries, and yet to be created in my father's testicles. Story 128. I was in 7th grade and had just started at a new school that went from 7th to 12th grade. I was in class. We did not get an announcement until sometime after 12 p.m., I think. Story 129. Was at the hospital with my mother and sisters. Remember us going to the mall to watch the news on Radio Shack televisions. Story 130. Working in a cubicle and wondering why the internet is slow. Story 131. I was in Calgary Airport waiting to fly home to the United Kingdom when the first plane hit. Every screen in the airport seemed to switch to news channels, and the airport went very quiet. I got a ride back to Edmonton and watched the rest on reruns that night. Story 132. 5th grade computer class. We all sat on the floor and watched the coverage until everyone was taken to the cafeteria. Parents began picking up their children from school for the day. Story 133. 5th grade. I did not fully understand what was happening. We all gathered in the assembly room, and the faculty were in tears while they had the news on the television. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.